Hey everybody, what's going on? Hexlex here, got another Master Duel video for you. So today we're going to be talking about Tearlaments yet again. It's funny, this is actually the most I've dedicated videos to a specific deck before it's even come out yet, because we already looked at 5 tech cards that you can craft today to beat Tearlaments. And this time, we're going to take a look at 5 more cards that you can craft, this time to play in your Tearlaments deck. I do also have some more information about the Tearlaments cards themselves, coming out relatively soon. I'm going to be doing our Let's Talk About Tearlaments video, but as I mentioned in the last Tearlament related video, I want to wait until the archetype is officially announced for Master Duel, and if there are pre-hits, we know what the pre-hits are going to be. That way we know a little bit better how the deck can be built and are not working off of pure speculation. You might argue that that's what this is, however, we have enough examples from the TCG and OCG to know generally what kind of a card should go on a Tearlaments deck. We just don't know the exact ratios just yet. So, like I said, we're going to be talking about some cards that, if you don't have these yet and you plan on playing Tearlaments, you're definitely going to want to get these crafted soon. These are all going to be ultra rare cards, the 5 that we're going to be covering today. And I wanted to go over those to make sure that we all had enough craft points ready for when Tearlaments came out, not just for the Tearlaments themselves, but some of these cards we're talking about as well. I still have to craft a couple of these cards here on the list myself, so we'll definitely be doing that once we, again, see confirmation that Tearlaments are coming out and in what ratios we will be allowed to play them. So, without further ado, I'm just going to go ahead and start diving straight into this. So the first card that I want to make sure that I talk about today is Instant Fusion. It should also be mentioned that these are not the only 5 Ultras you need to craft if you don't have any of these cards to play Tearlaments. There are some more other commonly used cards. We'll go over that a little bit later here, but I wanted to cover 5 cards that most people might not have in their collection, and Instant Fusion is one of them. Instant Fusion hasn't been useful in too many meta decks in Master Duel's time. Really, only Prank Kids would it saw a brief amount of play in, but as far as like Tier 1 or even really 2 meta decks, Instant Fusion hasn't seen a lot of play. In Tearlaments, however, Instant Fusion is capable of summoning Tearlaments Kitkalos, which is the deck's best fusion monster, making this card a staple for any Tearlaments deck as long as both of those cards are going to be legal. For those who don't know, Tearlaments Kitkalos has 3 very powerful effects. When it's summoned, you can either take a Tearlaments card from your deck and either put it in your hand or in the graveyard. You can destroy a card on the field, and then also on top of that, when Kitkalos leaves the field due to a card effect, including her own, you can blow her up with her own card effect to do this. You get to just mill your top 5 cards, which, of course, for Tearlaments is very, very good because that's how they fuse. So, in that regard, of course, as I just mentioned, Kitkalos can search, summon, and mill Tearlaments monsters by itself, making Instant Fusion essentially a 1-card starter for the deck. It's actually more than just like a 1-card starter, too. This card is useful. It can set up so many different kinds of plays, and not only by itself, but then, of course, once you factor it being used in conjunction with the other Tearlaments cards, we really start to see just how powerful it is. It's not just a good starter going first, but also going second as well, because by sending the Tearlaments Rhino Heart from the deck to the graveyard using Kitkalos' effect, this card can essentially be used to make Tearlaments Kaleido Heart by itself. Tearlaments Kaleido Heart is the quote-unquote big boss fusion monster of the deck, even though Kitkalos is the better fusion monster because it's more of an enabler. Rhino Heart is the big one. It's got 3,000 attack and defense. When it's summoned, it can shuffle a card on the field back into the deck, and it can keep sending more cards to the graveyard as well. So, yeah, Instant Fusion overall, an extremely good card for the Tearlaments deck. Very, very nice, and yeah, definitely among all these cards, I think this is the one that's going to absolutely be the most of a staple. Like, you definitely are going to want to get your 1 Instant Fusion for Tearlaments if you haven't already. Another card that's very good for the deck, but we will probably be needing more than 1 copy of, is going to be Diviner of the Heralds, or I guess Diviner just of the Herald. This is actually a card that's been seeing a resurgence in play recently. It first saw play way back in Season 1 through 4 as part of the, of course, Drytron Herald deck that was very infamous. Once Ben 10 went to 1, Drytrons fell off pretty quick, was still about the only place Diviner really saw play. But, of course, we have been seeing Diviner of the Herald quite a bit in the recent Ishizu decks, and we will definitely expect to see that trend continue moving forward to the Tearlaments decks that are going to be using the Ishizu cards. So if you haven't already crafted this card for either Drytron Herald or Ishizu piles, then you're definitely going to want to go ahead and get at least 2 copies. I think 2 is probably going to be enough. I'm going to start with 2. We might end up needing 3, but from what I could tell in my research of looking at a bunch of lists that have done really well, it seems that a lot of them are playing 2 Diviner of the Herald. Now, granted, these lists were when the Ishizu cards were first released in the OCG/TCG, and they were all at 3, so maybe with the cards having come into Master Duel semi-limited, we could possibly see needing a 3rd Diviner of the Herald to make them a little bit more consistent, but Diviner of the Herald is capable of sending fairy monsters directly from the deck to the graveyard when summoned. As I mentioned, this allows you to get your Ishizu Millers in the graveyard, and that's going to get started on your Tearlaments and your plays as a result. So the Ishizus, of course, are good because they, all mill a bunch of cards, and of course, all the Tearlaments, or rather 3 of the main deck Tearlament monsters, can fusion summon when sent to the graveyard using monsters in your graveyard. And they don't even banish either. They put themselves back on bottom of your deck. So it's just more recycling. You can recycle not only the Tearlament monsters themselves, but also anything you just want back in your deck. And but of course, you need to start milling in order to start getting these plays. So Diviner of the Herald ends up being a great way to get those plays started. In addition to sending the Ishizu monsters from the main deck to the graveyard, you also can optionally play Elder Entity Natis in your extra deck. This will give Diviner the option to destroy cards as well, making it much like Insta-Fusion, how that has some usage both going first and second. Playing Elder Entity Natis in the extra deck can potentially offer Diviner the ability to pop cards on the opponent's field going second, giving it a little more extra playability in that regard as well. Now, Elder Entity Natis, which is also an ultra rare, is definitely not required. I definitely saw quite a few Tearlament lists not playing that card, so that one is decently optional, but it's not a bad option to have if you have it and or the extra deck space. And of course, when you send Agito, Kelbeck, or Natis, Diviner becomes a level 6 tutor monster, and thus, in combination with a level 4 monster, of which this deck has plenty laying around, namely Rhino Heart, you can actually Secret Summon a Baron de Fleur and add it to your end board. So, Baron de Fleur, that's a card that I think a lot of people already have, which is why I didn't really mention it specifically and separately in this list, but again, I wanted to cover some cards that you're definitely going to need for Tearlaments that a decent amount of people probably don't have just yet, even if you have been playing competitive decks. When it comes to Baron, though, there's quite a few competitive decks that she's been in since her release, so... but yeah, the Diviner, like I said, being able to set up mills, it can pop cards, and it can set you up for a Baron de Fleur. So, overall, great card. Again, most lists I saw during my research were only playing 2 copies. However, again, due to the nature of a lot of these Ishizu cards being at 2 in Master Duel, it is possible that 3 copies of this card are actually correct. Again, before I can start really, theory crafting out a deck list, I really want to make sure that I know what the ratios of Tearlaments monsters are going to be when they come into the game there. Alright, for our next card we're going to talk about here, let's go on to Abyss Dweller. This is probably a very familiar face, as this card came up during our last discussion as well of cards to play against Tearlaments. So here we're seeing Abyss Dweller once again, but also, even if you're planning on countering Tearlaments, you need to do that within a Tearlaments deck itself. So Abyss Dweller kind of is playing double duty on that front. Abyss Dweller is actually fairly easy to make in Tearlaments, and it'll be a very, very powerful card, not just against the mirror match, but against a lot of decks. There are a lot of decks that will incidentally activate monster effects in the graveyard, particularly, of course, since the release of the Ishizu cards and those kind of 60-card Grass Ishizu pile decks. Of course, being so graveyard-centric, are going to have a lot of those graveyard-based effects. So I expect to see a decent amount of other other Ishizu decks and other Tearlaments decks too, other than just Ishizu tier. But though Ishizu tier will be top among those, Abyss Dweller is going to definitely get its work put in, very much so. Regardless, really, if you're playing with or against Tearlaments, you really just need an Abyss Dweller. Abyss Dweller is going to be definitely an extra deck staple moving forward. Its effect to shut down, effects that activate in the graveyard, it only applies to your opponent's graveyard. So you can actually freely use this effect during either turn to slap your opponent. It's not like, it's not an effect that goes both ways for the entire turn, so you can only use it on your opponent's turn. No, you can use it during your turn as well, which makes it very good against Tearlaments, because, of course, Tearlaments have the ability to do a lot of plays during the opponent's turn. If they go first, they can set up a lot of trap cards, each of which enables the Tearlament monsters to fuse by sending Tearlament monsters to the graveyard. But on top of that, I can never remember which Tearlament it is by name, but one of the Tearlaments actually has the effect to mill 3 cards as a quick effect when the opponent activates a monster effect. So, it's not terribly uncommon at all for Tearlaments to actually be playing like part of their turn on your first turn, like even if they go second. So making an Abyss Dweller on turn 1, like if you know you're playing a Tearlament mirror match, trying to make this card first before you do anything else might not even be like the most terrible idea in the world. Now, to be fair, I don't know really how feasible that's going to be, but the moral of the story is, it only affects your opponent's graveyard, so you can use this card, like, very freely. You don't have to wait for, like, a certain time. You also don't have to, like, waste any resources protecting it either, because Dweller's effect lasts the entire turn, and due to the way it's worded, Dweller doesn't even have to be on the field in order to have the effect apply for the entire turn. It's because it says, this turn, card effects cannot activate in the opponent's graveyard. If it was simply a continuous effect that required Dweller to be on the field, it would simply say, like, card effects cannot activate in your opponent's graveyard, or something just to that effect. But the fact that it says this turn, that does not only mean that it will apply again for the entire turn, but that is regardless of whether or not Dweller remains on the field. So again, this is shaping up to be just about a mandatory craft moving forward. Again, regardless if you want to play with or against Tearlaments, if you have not already, I highly recommend crafting a copy of Abyss Dweller. Next card we're going to take a look at is Time Thief Redoer. Time Thief Redoer is a generic rank 4 monster that actually, so far in Master Duel, has not seen a whole lot of play beyond its own archetype. There are certainly decks besides Time Thief that have made use of it, but it has mostly just kind of like, flown under the radar a bit. This is, however, a pretty good generic rank 4 monster. Indeed, not just Time Thief Redoer, but a number of generic rank 4 monsters actually get a lot better because of Tearlament's ability to make these monsters with relative ease. Another one I'm thinking of that I think also happens to be an ultra rare would be Evil Storm Exciton Knight, but I picked the rank 4 that I saw just across the board in all of these builds, which was Time Thief Redoer. Now, that might seem a bit strange, when it comes to generic rank 4s and their effects. At a glance, Time Thief Redoer might not seem like the most impressive, but there are really a couple of key factors that make this card pretty relevant for the Tearlaments deck. Time Thief Redoer is a pretty unique Xyz monster in that it detaches as part of the resolution of its effect, not as the cost. This means that the effects of Tearlament monsters will activate when detached from Redoer. It's the same as Gigantic Sprite, actually. Gigantic Sprite, as I'm sure all of you know, I'm sure everyone who's watching this video has played against Sprite at some point or another. You might have noticed, if you don't, play the deck and aren't already intimately familiar with this, that Gigantic Sprite actually does not detach the material until the effect resolves. And it's the same case with Time Thief Redoer here. Now, because that's the case, if we think of the wording of Tearlament monsters' effects, right, the one that allows them to fuse, they activate when the card is sent to the graveyard by a card effect. And then now you can kind of see the connection here. Time Thief Redoer detaches its materials, again, not as a cost, but as part of the resolution of the effect. Therefore, any Tearlament monster that has the ability to fuse that gets detached from Redoer, that has the ability to then fusion summon via its effect. And of course, it does not even necessarily have to be a level 4 monster due to Time Thief Redoer's ability to attach, although I suppose it only attaches with cards from the opponent's deck, not cards from yours. But in any case, it will still allow Tearlaments monsters to get their fusion effects when detached. Not only that, but also even the Tearlaments main deck monster that doesn't fuse when it detached, Rhinoheart, actually greatly benefits from the inclusion of Time Thief Redoer as well. Tearlaments Rhinoheart summons itself from the graveyard, but then banishes itself when it would be sent back to the graveyard from the field. By using it as an Xyz material, you can actually circumvent this drawback. And of course, what level does Rhinoheart happen to be but level 4? So that's another very good reason to have the Time Thief Redoer. Really just rank 4s in general in the extra deck in that regard, but Time Thief Redoer is also a very good just generic rank 4 to have as well, because the conditions to activate its effect, well, it doesn't really have any. That's the other thing too. You can, detach a material from Time Thief Redoer at pretty much any given time, and from there, that allows you to put your Rhinohearts in the graveyard to trigger your Tearlaments effects, so on and so forth, at any given time as well. Let's see. Yeah, so the other thing you do want to keep in mind, though, right, is that the Tearlaments monsters that are sent to the graveyard, while they are attached as Xyz materials, that will not cause them to trigger their effects. They have to be detached by the effect of Time Thief Redoer. The reason for this is, let's say Time Thief Redoer with a Tearlaments monster underneath it is on the field, and it gets destroyed by, I don't know, Raigeki. That will not cause the Tearlaments monster to be triggered, its effect, because it was not sent to the graveyard by a card effect. It got sent to the graveyard by basically a game mechanic, by being an Xyz material that is attached to an Xyz monster that is being sent to the graveyard. So if you're ever wondering, like, hey, why does this work when I detach for Redoer, but then if I opponent Raigekis, like I said, then it doesn't get the effect? Well, that's why. You do have to detach it as part of the effect, or it just has to be sent to the graveyard as part of an effect. And again, being sent to the graveyard while being attached to an Xyz monster as a material, that's actually leaving the field due to a game mechanic and not a card effect. So, important distinction there. Alright, one last card that I wanted to talk about here, card number 5. That's going to be El Shaddoll Winda. It's another card that I think a lot of you have probably faced at least at one point or another. El Shaddoll Winda, of course, being that pesky Shaddoll monster that can not only not be destroyed by card effects, but more importantly, only allows each player to special summon once per turn while it's on the field. So, the Tearlaments monsters that can fusion summon are all dark, every single one of them, meaning that they can be used, each of them can be used with any Shaddoll monster at all to make Winda. From what I can tell, the two most popular choices of main deck Shaddoll monsters to play accompanying the Tearlaments would be Squamata and or Beast. You do want, if you're going to play El Shaddoll Winda in your extra deck, you do want to make sure you have at least 3, maybe 2 you can maybe get away with, but at least 2 or 3 main deck Shaddoll monsters, because again, we need to be milling our Shaddoll monsters into the graveyard to then fuse them with the Tearlaments monsters effect, because Tearlaments fuse from the graveyard. So, and then of course, the Shaddoll monsters have their own fun effects when sent to the graveyard as well, but again, the main purpose is to, of course, run out the El Shaddoll Winda. The cool thing about using Winda in Tearlaments is that Tearlaments can fusion summon during the opponent's turn very, very easily, meaning that you can surprise your opponent by summoning Winda at an inopportune time for your opponent to play around. Like, if, for example, you're going first and you have your graveyard set up in a way that you basically know you can summon a Winda during your opponent's turn, you can wait until your opponent has already started to make their combo, to make their play, and they've committed a certain amount of resources to it. Then you can drop a Winda on their board, because if you drop Winda before your opponent really makes any plays, then there's a chance that, your opponent will have some kind of an out that they could play around it, or maybe they could play their turn in a different way to best play around the Winda. But again, if you can actually summon this card during your opponent's turn, like mid-play, that can often catch them off guard, and then in turn leave them with much fewer resources. This card is in a lot of the Tearlaments lists that I looked at, but it wasn't in every single one of them. So I will say, of the cards that we've talked about, this is the most quote-unquote optional of the bunch. Like, if you don't have the UR materials, or if you just don't want to play a Shaddoll engine in your Tearlaments deck, that's fine. Like, that's not something that you're, like, hugely missing out on. I mean, you potentially might be missing out on a very good Floodgate type effect, but it's not going to, you know, cause your Tearlament deck to function any less at its core. Whereas the other cards we've talked about, those being, of course, Instant Fusion, Diviner, Abyss Dweller, and Time Thief Redoer, those 4 cards were in, like, literally every single Tearlament list I was looking at. To be fair, I was looking more at OCG builds than TCG. That's what I tend to like to do because Master Duel's ban list does tend to more closely reflect the OCG than the TCG. But again, among all those lists, I saw Instant Fusion, Diviner, Time Thief Redoer, and Abyss Dweller in every single one. El Shaddai Window was in most of them. It was in probably about 75% of the list, but again, this card is the one of these that I've mentioned so far that you can most get away without playing. Alright, so those are the 5 cards there that I wanted to cover. Again, 5 ultra rares that you might want to get if you haven't already in preparation for the Tearlaments. I do have a couple of final thoughts here to cover some points among these topics that we didn't delve into greatly so far. So there are other more commonly used extra deck monsters that are available now that are used in Tearlament decks. I didn't bring them up specifically because these are, like I said, more generic, and I think people are more likely to have this. But for those curious, other extra deck monsters that you want for Tearlaments are going to include Baron de Fleur, Divine Arsenal, Zeus, Sky Thunder, Sprite Elf, number 41 Baguska, the Terribly Tired Tapir. That's a pretty good one. Particularly if you get hit with like Dimension Shifter, Baguska is often like the best thing to then end on. Predaplant Dragostapelia. To be fair, Dragostapelia isn't used in like a lot of decks, but it's used in branded, like all the branded variants pretty much. So I thought that was like kind of popular enough to not include. Plus, it's only a super, so that one's not as like, you know, you don't have to be quite as mindful of something like that. And then, as I mentioned earlier, you can optionally include Elder Entity and Atis in the extra deck as well to send off of the Diviner there. That grass looks greener. Let's talk about this for a second, because I know this is going to get brought up in some capacity. Especially because I don't think we had grass in the TCG whenever we had Tearlaments. I think grass got banned quite a while ago in the TCG. So I've seen a lot of people say that, like, oh, Tears are going to be extra busted in Master Duel because Master Duel has grass and the TCG doesn't. Well, the thing is, the OCG had grass as well, and grass Tearlament was never really that great of a deck, honestly. That grass looks greener. It can optionally be used in Tearlament decks, but it's not necessarily optimal. The deck already has enough ways to mill without grass. You know, pretty much every single Tearlaments card in some capacity will send some amount of cards from your deck to the graveyard. So in that regard, you really don't end up needing grass that much. But more importantly, 60 cards is too many to consistently mill tier monsters without actually using that grass looks greener. It's like, yes, when you have 60 cards and you're milling with grass, of course there's like no way you're not going to mill at least one Tearlament monster. But you know, you think about like the Ishizu mills or the Tearlament mills, which are mills of like 3 or 5 cards at a time. Then that becomes a lot harder to hit a Tearlament monster off of those when you're playing 60 cards, and there really are just not enough like main deck Tearlament monsters that fuse that you can play 60 cards. There's, assuming none of them get pre-hit, there's 9 altogether. And then Rhino Heart's also good to send to the graveyard even if it doesn't fuse, but that's still a grand total of 12 Tearlament monsters. And you know, when I was playing Adamancipator, I found that in a 60 card deck, when I'm excavating 5 cards at a time to hit a rock monster, I found that 14 rock monsters was too few. So you think about trying to mill one of 12 Tearlament monsters at 5 cards at a time and 60 cards. It just becomes, the ratios are just not there for it. You can play grass in Tearlaments. It is something you can do, but the list that I saw that were adapting grass were actually playing like 50 cards and not 60. With the intent of milling somewhere in the neighborhood of the top 5 to 10 cards, instead of trying to mill like 15 to 20, like 60 card grass decks tend to like to do. And again, this was honestly mainly because, you know, the ratios are just not there to play 60 cards. So You know, it's one of those things where it's like, on paper, you see that grass is legal, and you're like, oh my god, Tearlaments are going to be insane with that, but in practice, it actually doesn't really end up playing out that well. So don't feel like you have to craft grass for this deck. It's definitely not needed. It's really not optimal. So if you don't already have grass, I wouldn't really bother with it just for Tearlaments there. Now, one thing I also want to note real quick before we end off the video is that when talking about these techs in the decks that they are slotted in, I am referring to, when I say Tearlaments, I'm really referring to Ishizu Tearlaments, which are, you know, with the TCG and OCG are any indicators, the best variant of them. There are a few different ways to play Tearlaments, though, again, it's going to look much like the TCG and OCG, where the Ishizu cards are looking to be the best cards to pair with them, due to their easy ability to mill and also be sent off of stuff like Diviner. If you open, you know, of course, Keldo or Mudora with one of your millers, you can send a miller that way. And then they also get milled off of the Tearlament monsters too. So just pretty good synergy all around between those two archetypes. So that is going to do it. I hope you all found this video helpful as we get closer and closer to the Tearlaments deck. Again, you know, be sure to stay tuned for the channel, or rather on this channel, for more updates as far as that goes. Again, as soon as they get officially announced in the game, I'm going to throw up my brief primer on Tearlaments, or Let's Talk About Tearlaments video. And then, of course, upon release, we are going to not only open a whole bunch of packs, but definitely be rocking the Tearlaments themselves. So, that's going to go ahead and do it. Let's go to move now to our outro. Alright everybody, thank you so much for watching all the way to the very end of the video like this. That means a whole lot to me. Not just personally, but it's also a great way of supporting the channel as well. If you're interested in supporting the channel in other means, you can of course feel free to comment and or subscribe right here on YouTube. I'm always looking to the comments section. You guys leave some pretty awesome feedback as far as like constructive criticism goes when it comes to deck building, gameplay, channel content, all that stuff. So feel free to leave your opinion down there. I will be sure to take a look at that there. And then subscribing is going to be the best way to get notifications of when these videos drop. That does happen every day, by the way, so if you're looking for daily Master Duel content, you've come to the right place. And there are more places where you can get some daily Master Duel content. If you check out the description below, follow the top link over to my Patreon page. There for just $5 a month, which is as much as you pay for a booster pack. You'll find a lot more value than a pack full of filler over there. We've got some previews for content upcoming here on the channel. We've got some exclusive games that are only posted over on Patreon over there. We've got some Q&As, and then you can also have your name featured in this lovely credit sequence where I thank all of the people who are helping contribute over there on Patreon. It's a huge support to the channel, and it really means a lot as well. So thank you everyone who is donating that is featured here on screen. And again, you know, it's not just a pure donation, you do get some more daily Master Duel content over there just for being a part of the Patreon. But I think that's about all the time that I have for today's video. Once again, I just want to thank you so very much for sticking all the way to the end of the video. Again, it just means a lot, as I do put a decent amount of work into getting these videos out every single day. But that's about all the time that I've got for now, so without further ado, this is XLex. I'm signing out, and I hope you have a fantastic day.